Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call The Buried Emperor. Now, it's been a while since I've done a new character from A Village Corrupted, and I just was really feeling inspired around this particular idea, so I decided to run with it. I've been working on a lot more of the world building stuff, so for those of you who want more information, that will actually be coming soon. But for now, if you haven't heard of A Village Corrupted, I encourage you to look through my videos or look through my Instagram. You can go with the hashtag A Village Corrupted on Instagram, and you should be able to find all the characters and start finding out kind of what this is about. Now, there'll be way more opportunity in this video for me to talk about him and the story behind him and his design. For now, let's just talk about the techniques and sort of what you're seeing here. This is all done in the beginning part using the symmetry tool, which is located under canvas. It's like under guides or guided canvas or canvas guide or whatever it is. I think you'll be able to find it, and then you can sort of see what you can turn on and off there and experiment. For this one, it's just using a simple left to right symmetry with a line that's right straight down the middle, so it's basically the default symmetry setting. And what you see here is I did like his body and his head and his ears and all that kind of stuff, all done with symmetry. But then when I got to the hands and the lower part of the arms, that's a new layer. Same thing with the beard, how the beard is not perfectly symmetrical and the hair is not perfectly symmetrical. So as I've said before in other pieces I did that had all of this kind of symmetry, it's really important to try and find opportunities to break up that symmetry unless you are very specifically going for something that is symmetrical across the board and you want it to feel that way. If it's something like this where you have a character that's looking at you straight on and you want them to still feel pretty natural, that means you have to find a few opportunities to break that up a bit. So since his costume is perfectly symmetrical and his face is more or less perfectly symmetrical, all of that makes sense to have be done with the symmetry tool turned on. And then the positioning of his hands and his hair and his beard and a couple of other little things throughout, those kind of things you can turn it off. Or like that little sort of clasp on his neck there that sort of looks like a weird, almost like musical note. That is not what it is, but that's just kind of what it looks like. That all of that you can turn it off and then seek out some of that asymmetry to give it a little bit more of a natural feel. Now, I did this guy around the same time that I did a couple of the other symmetrical pieces, so that's why it was like this sort of period where it just made sense. I just kind of was like, yeah, let's keep doing straight on type stuff. I was kind of sick of doing 3/4 things, so that's why you get another one. Although for this character, the other ones were more just on a whim. This one, it just made sense given the type of character this guy is and the pose that I wanted him in. It just made sense to have him be straight on. Now, in the past, I promised people on Instagram that I was going to go into a lot more lore stuff for A Village Corrupted when I did the video for this character. So I am going to do that, and I'm going to try to stop and describe what's happening artistically when that made sense. Well, let's get into some lore stuff here. What you're seeing me draw here is like a fetus or like a very young baby. That is going to be encased in something in a second. Before you mentally get there, I want you to know that I mentally got to the point where I realized that this was way close to the visual for a Death Stranding, which is a game that I'm excited about. However, I came up with this idea separately from that, at least consciously separate from it, and after I put all the pieces together, I turned to my wife and I was like, you know what this looks like? And she was like, a Death Stranding? And I was like, yeah, I gotta change this. So I'm not really going to talk about the purpose of the baby too much because it's ultimately going to be the same purpose of what is trapped in the big crystal. But I think the thing that's more important to note here is that here's another example of where I get out of the symmetry, deliberately creating something that is asymmetrical to then be held in his asymmetrically positioned hands. And now let's actually talk about the lore behind this character a little bit more, since we've got the baby sort of out of the way, the explanation of the baby out of the way, because the baby does get removed here in a second. So a lot of you were correct in assuming that this character is a vampire. If you followed A Village Corrupted a long time ago, I did a character called the Flayer, and he is a vampire. He's particularly an outcasted vampire, and this is essentially the king of the vampires, this character named the Buried King. He is, or the buried emperor, sorry, not the buried king. And so he is a vampire, which is evident by his anatomy, his big claws, his big ears, and a little bit his skin tone. I won't really go into the exact, I'm not going to go into all the detail in the lore here, but basically what I'll tell you is that in this world, the vampires are a little bit more monster-like than, say, in like Interview with a Vampire, or even something like Vampire Hunter D. They do have, you know, these really long bodies, these big hands with claws on them. However, their society really looks down on people who sort of embrace that aspect of them. They try not to act like beasts or monsters, but occasionally that happens, and people, vampires who do it a lot, are really looked down upon in this society. And that's kind of where the Flayer comes in. He is definitely someone who lets his more vampire-y nature take over. Now, let's not go much further then into the vampires in that way, because this is ultimately a demo, and I want to give a little bit of insight into the story without getting too heavy on story. The thing that you may want to know about the crystal that he's holding is that is sort of like amberized blood, or like crystallized blood that he is holding, and what I replaced the baby with is sort of, I guess you could say, thematically a similar notion. I'm not going to say exactly what's in that crystal yet, but just know that what's in there are the remains of an important vampire, let's put it that way, and they've been crystallized inside there. And that's why when we actually get to the part where I'm defining that, you'll see there's sort of like, there's silhouetted parts and there's sort of fleshy bits, and I'm just sort of using those two visual languages define this kind of mess of stuff that's in there, I guess you could say. This object is a religious artifact, and the vampires do rally around this artifact, and that's why he is holding it so sort of like lovingly, and why it looks very important in the image. Also, as you can see when the image wraps up, the environment that he's in has almost like this slightly hostile religious quality, I guess you could say, and that was deliberate. I wanted it to look like a cathedral or something, but not specific, and I wanted it to look a little pointy and a little uncomfortable, because theoretically in this world you shouldn't be comfortable in that scenario, because it's almost like a vampire church vibe kind of thing. So that's really the gist behind this illustration. As far as more lore goes, I don't want to go too much further. I guess the last thing that I could sort of describe, the last thing that I could say to describe the vampires in this world, and that's what I really want to try and communicate with this particular character, is the vampires in the universe of A Village Corrupted are kind of like the high elves of the world. They are essentially the most articulate, the most educated, the most knowledgeable, and the most well-off in this universe. So I think that for now is good. I think that gives people some insight into some of the imagery here, and why this character has similarities to the Flayer, but is ultimately different than the Flayer. I think that goes far enough into that. So let's get back into the art stuff. So we're definitely abusing the symmetry tool quite a bit in this piece. The character's costume, as I said before, is symmetrical, and his pose is largely symmetrical. This is pretty awesome in a lot of ways, because of course it means we only have to draw something once. There are some things that we have to take into consideration, of course, which is just usually when you're working a character in perspective and you're not having this sort of doubling up happening, you can sort of make adjustments to the anatomy in real time. Of course, in this case, you have to also be certain that some of the things you're doing isn't impacting the anatomy negatively when it's actually doubled over. This is a much bigger problem usually when you're working in an environment where you can't automatically do the symmetry. So you have to sort of do one half and then duplicate it and flip it, and then keep working on one half and duplicate it and flip it. But in the end, you still have to be a little bit concerned with it. His costume, because it's symmetrical, we want to sort of try and emphasize its opulence to some degree. So I'm making sure that every aspect of it feels fitted in a specific way, and that he's got like things like the this chest piece that's like this big sort of symbolic symbol And then having lots of things like repetitive rivets and patterning and all of that, these are all ways to try and make it feel more special. When you have more asymmetry, well, actually, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say more asymmetry looks more slapdash, because obviously there are very refined ways to do asymmetry. But I think that, let's put it this way, when you want to go for something that feels like it's less put together, asymmetry can be one of your tools. For instance, if you, it's like the Nathan Drake half of his shirt untucked kind of thing. When you start introducing that, it has a good opportunity to introduce a certain amount of chaos, which can be really good in a character design when you're trying to communicate that. In fact, the Flayer, the other character I referenced, his outfit is technically symmetrical at a base level, but then he has things on top of that that's making him very asymmetrical. And that was a way to sort of show at the time his vampire nature, that he came from somewhere, but then he's got these modifications to it. Of course, one of the most fun aspects of working with symmetry is that you can focus on one side and then magically the other side gets done. So what you're seeing here is I've created a new layer that is not not symmetrical, and I just used it to create guidelines for this patterning that was on his one shoulder, and then in creating a new layer on top of that that is symmetrical, I can use that new layer that's been lowered in opacity as my guide and only work on one shoulder. I'm working on his right shoulder, which is our left if we're looking at the image, and that's where the roughs are for that patterning, and then I'm just drawing on that one side, and of course it's replicating on the other side because that's how this whole thing works. So when you're trying to do these types of really repetitive things, it's awesome to use these assisted tools just to make things go faster and smoother. It allows you to kind of focus on different things, which is good. That's what you want. You want to be focusing on making this really interesting, not, how am I going to get all of this done? This is super repetitive. This is really boring, like that type of thing. I mean, I don't know. Different art minds work different ways. There are, of course, some art minds that love hyper repetitive pattern based things. I'm absolutely not that person. So for me, anytime I can replicate that process and automate it, it's way better for me. So what we see also in his design, here's a little bit of a quality, a backstory, which also feeds into character design for these vampires, is they're obsessed with clear crystal. I haven't gone so far as to say whether or not in this world it is diamond or not, but let's just say that there's a crystal in this world that they are obsessed with because of how clear it is, and that's actually, it ties into their whole desire to be sort of without any type of taint, any type of thing that makes them feel like they are actually monsters, or that they are these vampires that they are. They like the purity angle of the whole thing. And so people who are really high up, vampires who are really high up in the social structure, have these clear crystals, and then ones that are lower in the social structure actually have muddier crystals that have a little bit more of a reddish color to them. Obviously, it's all just pretty heavy-handed symbolism for the blood, and their craving of the blood, and them trying to sort of distance themselves from that quality. And it's a little bit of like a wink wink that the king has these crystals all in his costuming, and so does the Flayer. It's not so wink wink. I don't want you all to think that like the Flayer is like his son or some shit like that. It's not that on the nose. It's more just trying to hint at sort of like where the Flayer comes from. So now we've put in all this patterning, and we've got a lot of the stuff that has to be symmetrical done, and now we're moving into the really strong asymmetrical aspects, which are his hands and the crystal that he's holding. So at this point, we're just following the rough lines that were already there. There was the rough lines were actually brought to a pretty good level of finish, and so that I'm not having to actually solve a lot here. I want to point out some aspects of his character design as well as his posing and the deliberate choices that were made there. For one, you can see that he's got these sort of like long sleeves that go into sort of these, not really gauntlets, but almost like gloves. They come up, but then they cut at kind of a weird spot. They sort of cut like right over the knuckle, and they do on the other side as well. And then also his hands are in kind of interesting positions. I want to actually reference specifically why that was chosen. I find that there's a lot of costuming both in the real world and in fictitious worlds, where it's completely impractical, and it's kind of informed by this notion that the person who is wearing those clothes doesn't actually have to think about the practicality. It's not something that ever crosses their mind because they just don't have to. Their life is so nice or without struggle or whatever that they can sort of do these things that would maybe be uncomfortable to a normal person. And it might seem really minor, but I find it really important to me that there's aspects of his costuming that's all about that. It's all about the fact that someone who is actually living in this world and wasn't surrounded by everything that somebody like an emperor is surrounded by, or surrounded with, they don't think about the fact that having that glove end where it ends might be impractical for this reason or that reason, or the fact that his shoulders are exposed and you might not want that to be like that, or maybe there's just other aspects to this, like the fact that it's super tight around his body, but it definitely seems like a really thin material. It doesn't seem protective. And I think that there's modern real life examples of this as well. Certain people who have certain lifestyles, they think a certain way about the way their clothing is, or other facets of their life, and they don't have to worry about something that somebody else might have to worry about. Someone might dress a specific way to deal with their environment. And in something as extreme as this fantasy story, that is really apparent. Like when you look at other characters here that I've created, you've got characters that are fully armored because of what they deal with, and then you've got this guy who's more or less, I mean, his clothing in some ways is bondagey in some ways, not deliberately so, but just more to try and capture his physical form and like what he is being a vampire. But there's a lot of examples in this, or not examples, sorry, there's a lot of evidence in his design that shows that he doesn't have to think about those things. And I think that that's an important thing to try and figure out. And I think you could do it a lot of different ways. Like you can do it with things like expensive jewelry or impractical things that impede movement, but this person doesn't have to worry about those things, all that kind of stuff. So that was a long rant about like why his gloves look the way they are and stuff, but let's also talk about his hand placements. Really, this is about trying to capture two things. He has very peculiar anatomy because he has these giant hands with these big fingernails on them, and then also the fact that he's trying to lovingly hold this crystal, and just sort of the posture and the pose that he takes while doing so. I wanted it to look very different to the way the Flayer is depicted. If you go back and you look at the Flayer, he's not handling anything delicately, and he's not trying to come off as anything other than sort of like a ruthless monster of sorts. And so that's the sort of idea behind trying to communicate how posh and fancy and sort of above station this guy tries to portray himself as at all times. So now we're just going through and adding the extra little detail on the glove that we also have on the other side. And now we're putting the little pockets on his outfit. Originally I was going to have that shape that's sort of on the pocket be three-dimensional, but then I decided instead to make it more of like an embroidered thing. Even when trying to do these characters that are supposed to be a little bit more, I guess, actually, let's say a little less battle ready, it's still nice to put things like the little pyramids on there, and then these little like hooks and stuff, and bladed type things, because it helps tie into the world as a whole, like it is part of the design aesthetic. So even though you're not a warrior, you would still get these little embellishments put on. And I kind of like also the fact that it kind of makes it look like he's like almost like a poser. You know, he's like a I'm tough, but I'm not kind of thing. So now we're throwing the cape on. And now we'll go in and actually finish up the crystal. So I take the general rough shape from the crystal that's on his chest, since that's what that's speaking to, and I duplicate it and then move it. I didn't like I liked it tying directly into that chest is basically where I'm going, instead of it being just this other weird crystal-y shape. So now we're in the crystal and we're starting to define the new thing that I had decided to put in there. I actually had a long conversation with my wife as to what we would replace that little baby vampire thing with, and we went through a lot of different ideas. and we ultimately settled on this one, which, as I said earlier, is essentially the remains of an important vampire. However, I'm not going to go any further, and no, it's not something as wink wink nudge nudge as like Dracula's remains, because this world doesn't have a notion of that, so don't worry about that. But the important point is just that these are pieces of a previous vampire that is for some reason important and for some reason collected in here. Now, as for communicating the shapes in here and just sort of how I could keep it general and not get too specific, and maybe by the time I actually bring all of this to fruition, it will be more specific, but for right now I wanted to keep it more just like hinting at a bunch of shapes. You can see we've got sort of like a spinal column in there. We've got these teeth. We've got like a hand piece that's like a bigger shape. And so then what I'm doing is I'm sort of switching between silhouetted shapes and then breaking that up with these fleshy colored shapes. And so you have the silhouetted hand and the silhouetted spine, the teeth. There's like an eyeball and a couple of other little things like tendony stuff and like what looks like a brain piece kind of floating in the middle there. And then we've got these fleshy liquid looking things that wrap around that. And so what we're doing is we're taking the shadow so that we can get a lot of shapes in there and fill the space and make it mysterious. I'm saying ugh there because I was really having to fill that in a lot. And then we're using these other ones that are lighter and can be colored to actually show some dimension and have some foreground background within that crystal, basically. Since the rest of this is just me filling it in, I'll also reference the fact or explain the fact that the insides of the crystal and then the crystal lines are on two separate layers when all is said and done, and then the vampire's lines are all on their own layer. And that was so that I could actually break all of this up and do different effects with it. Since it was a crystal and since I knew that those contents were going to be within that crystal, I wanted to be able to control their color and where they sat in the layer stack more efficiently, so I kept it all separate. That sort of goes back to what I talk about in lots of videos about how much of art is about like planning and organization. Obviously there are aspects of art that aren't about planning, of course, but when you're trying to do something like this where you want to have a plan because you have a vision for how something should end up, you got to make sure you're sort of on top of that plan the whole time. That way now, using those lines, and then when we get into the flats, we can actually set up depth between the hands in the foreground, the hands that are closest to us, and then the crystal, and then the contents of the crystal, and then the back of the crystal, and then his body. So now we've got all of the lines flattened, or not flattened, we've got them all clean. We've actually duplicated the file and deleted away all of the extra bullshit, like extra line layers and guiding layers and stuff. I already knew what I wanted the background color to be. I knew I wanted it to be this sort of sickly, yellowy transitioning into red. It's got this sort of religious aspect of it being like the light coming from above, but then it doesn't fade into a very pleasing color. It sort of fades into this kind of gross reddish color. It almost feels like I don't know, like blood and fat and a bunch of gross sort of things kind of mixing together. And that was the intention. I wanted this to feel a little religious, and like he is definitely, he belongs to opulence, I guess you could say, but that it was also kind of unsettling at the same time, and definitely sinister. Since I wanted some of the colors to be very similar to each other, like the skin, the hair, the main chest piece and glove piece, you can see that originally got laid in a little bit more saturated, which is kind of how I had it in my mind. But then once it became a reality on the page, it ended up being too much, and it was competing with like his hair color. Those colors will slightly change a little bit more as we go, but that's just the reality of, hey, this seems good, and then you put it down, and you're like, ooh, that's not good, and then you have to make adjustments from there. I'm not going to do any zooming in on the flatting process because the flatting process is very straightforward, but once we start getting into smaller tweaks, I'll bring the camera in closer for that. So usually things like those pyramids and the buckles would probably be more of a silver to denote that they're like steel or something like that, but in his case they're going to be gold because he's trying to show how fancy he is, of course. So in a second we're going to get to those, and those are going to be gold. I didn't want to go with too much gold across the entire thing because obviously it would get just really loud overall, and I wanted there to be maybe more of an understanding of the materials that they find to be nice and expensive and luxurious. So there's opportunities here that I take to pop it by using some of that gold, but then things like, for instance, the framing for each one of his crystals, those could all be gold as well, but we don't go with that. We go with this darker color and trying to bring a little bit of sophistication into his color palette. Aside from that gold, which is actually fairly muted, we go for sort of big hits with things like the crystal on his chest, and then obviously the crystal that he's holding. And he himself, we want his face to read as an important element, and with all these other things competing, that's when we bring in like the vignetting later, which I've done in all of the Village Corrupted pieces to try and bring some of that attention from the edges of the page up to the character's face. And you can see here on the diamonds or the crystals, we try to add some of that reflective light around there. We did the same thing on the flare, and so this is just to show that those are reflective since we're trying to go with them being sort of colorless as a whole. Now we're doing the flats for the crystal, which has to sit on top of all of the other flats along with the line layer for all of this, since we want to get everything behind it sort of shining through. So we just have to be careful with the way that we treat this part. This is one of my favorite things about the Village Corrupted pieces, is that they're so simple and so complex at the same time. There's a lot of simplicity in the fact that they're just flats and I don't do like a shadow layer, but then I try to find moments like what we've got right here where I try to really sell the material of this crystal. So we've got the little the goo and all that kind of stuff floating in there. We've got a solid for the overall crystal that's in the far back that's just lowered in opacity. We've got one closer that's just faded on the edges so that we can get that ring that's happening around there. Then we've got one more on top that we're lowering the opacity of to bring color to all of the contents of the crystal. And then we just put this big shine layer on top and a little bit of a drop shadow for where the arms are onto the crystal, and it's just so effective in selling the material of that crystal, and we're not putting all that much work into it at all. We also have some light sort of coming out of the bottom, like the light is passing through the crystal and casting onto him a little bit. And then of course putting things like the shine in his eyes and looking for other little opportunities across the piece to really sell materials and bring interest to certain parts of the image. And of course we're putting this rim light that's casting down from the top. Every Village Corrupted piece also has this, trying to keep some consistency so that from piece to piece they feel like they're all part of the same set of images. And so we're just putting this now on aspects of his face and his shoulders and all that. It's it's showing a lot of restraint to not go nuts with this. The idea is to just bring a little bit in so that it feels like light is affecting it, but not being so crazy as to really over render this and bring a lot of it in. And some of this was also able to be done with the symmetry tool. In fact, there's a lot going on here that is me turning the symmetry tool on and off, like during the flat process, during that rim lighting process, things like that. And so now we're just going to get some of the reflection of the symbol on his chest, the crystal on his chest, onto the actual crystal, and put some shine now across the other crystals that are all in his like little shoulder embellishments. Okay, now we're going to go into a part where I take this layer and I copy the whole thing and paste it into a new layer and then make it black, and then I use a mask to sort of erase away from that, and that's how I get this vignetting effect across him. And of course that rim light that's coming down from the top, that is on a separate layer so that I can put it on top of all of that and really make that rim light pop. Okay, now it's time to move on to the background. Now the background is just as symmetrical as he is, so we want to do the same method we've used on all the other Village Corrupted pieces, but we're going to be leveraging this symmetry. There's 3 layers, although I think I go one more on this one, usually of there's 3 of silhouetted stuff in the background, and what I do for this is I essentially just draw them in black and I zoom in real tight so that I can get really specific about that detail and keep that detail really cool. And then I just start working on kind of noodling away on the background and making sure there's all this cool detail and interesting stuff to look at, basically. The difference here is that because I wanted everything to be clean and a little bit more on the geometric sort of abstract side, it's a little harder to go in and throw in tons of little rando details, but there are still plenty in there, but it's nowhere near as like some of the other characters where they're obviously set in like a village and there's lots of little interesting details in the background. But I definitely tried to make sure that I was selling the overworked, really ornate and just like this display of sort of like money and craftsmanship. I really wanted that to be over the top, and so I tried to push that as much as possible. It's almost like they're living in like a gothic cheesecake factory. So right now this is all still on the same layer. It's just solid black. Then we start turning on like the next layer and we start painting that in and figuring out what that's going to look like. And that's the idea here. And so we eventually will have 3 or 4 layers that all then have to have their opacities lowered so that we can create that depth effect. And then we'll select the ones on top and delete away the ones below them so that there isn't the opacity overlapping nonsense happening. This all happens really quick, of course, because this is just really simple from an application perspective. It's just solid black, so I just go in, and then it's there. There's not a lot of multiple strokes that happen at this stage. I also wanted this intensity of sort of like all these spiky things sort of coming towards him as well. And what you see there is me just adjusting these levels a ton so that I can make sure that they are, selling that depth, but that they're not competing too much. Now we can reduce some of that competition, that visual competition, because all of the AVC pieces also have like fog rolling through, and we're adjusting some colors and trying to make sure this whole thing works. And that's the final color right there. Some of that sickly red that was in the background originally had to go. Unfortunately, that's just to reduce the competition overall in the image. But I think that the vibe that I was looking for originally is still there. I think that the king, the buried emperor, feels like he is, in this really intense church-like, cathedral-like environment, and that it's also kind of a hostile place. So I think ultimately everything that I was looking for to be communicated got communicated. So you'll be able to see the details in the pan through in a second. So I hope you enjoyed watching this. Thank you very much for watching. I also hope those of you who've been looking for more details on the world and some of these characters, I hope that that portion of the video was also interesting. As time goes on, as I said before, more and more will be revealed. This is not something that's going to be coming out like in the next, month or year or whatever, but it is something that I'm adding to over time, so I hope you enjoyed that. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.